slight angle of the screen today because unfortunately my phone mount broke. That was my fault for basically tightening it too much. Anyway, on to the subject of today's program. Now, 3 weeks ago, there was the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group's conference held at the Carnegie Institute in Dunfermline. Now, as we all know, because we're all independence supporters, we know what the outcome of this meeting was. But did you know that it seems very likely that the United Kingdom government issued a so-called D notice? Now, a D notice is a restriction on what may be reported by the British media. Usually, D notices are issued to the news media by the British government when a topic which they believe is sensitive to national security or in some way might be a risk to the integrity of the United Kingdom comes up in the news streams. Now, no government would issue a D notice on a meeting such as the SSRG unless they felt or knew that something very important, some piece of vital information, was going to come out of that meeting and be transmitted via the news feeds to you and I in our homes. So what was it that the United Kingdom seems to have been so terrified might come out in the news if they actually reported on the SSRG meeting? Now, you'll remember from my previous show, I mentioned that the SNP had completely blanked all the invitations that it had been sent by the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group to this event. The SSRG had invited everyone in Scotland who had any interest at all in Scottish liberation to attend the meeting, and yet the SNP blanked it. They didn't respond, they didn't acknowledge it was happening, and no actual current SNP MSP or MP actually turned up. Now, I understand that one retired SNP politician did show up and was impressed by what he'd seen. So what was it that the United Kingdom was so scared about? Well, it's emerged today in news feeds, and it's been released onto social media, that the SSRG, which at the time had held a series of debates in which they discussed Scotland's current constitutional situation, and it was established beyond any kind of doubt by many experts in the field, both political, commercial, and constitutional experts, had checked the history. Now, this is not just Scottish history, by the way, this is British history written by the British state, to see what had happened after 1707 and the signing of the Treaty of Union. Were Scotland and England, both countries, extinguished, and where or was a new state called Great Britain actually formed by legislation at Westminster? And the answer to that was no. The United Kingdom was never formally ratified by the Westminster Parliament. The Westminster Parliament wasn't extinguished. England as a country wasn't extinguished. It just simply changed its name to Great Britain. And because of that, the Union didn't actually exist. And that was further reinforced by a historic statement by Scotland's leading law expert, Professor Robert Black, KC, King's Counsel, who stated quite bluntly that Scotland had never entered into a union with England. There was no legal evidence that this had ever been done, and therefore we're not actually in a union, certainly not in a union that we volunteered for, because nobody volunteered for it. And so that's left Scotland's situation open to reinterpretation, and that reinterpretation has now been followed up by Salvo, which is the campaigning and education arm of Liberation Scotland, hiring the human rights organisation Justice for All International, which is a European organisation of human rights lawyers. Now, what's interesting about this is that the news today is that Justice for All International has just made a statement saying that the formal request for Scotland to be listed at the United Nations C24 committee for full decolonisation status. In other words, to be added to a list of 17 countries which are now listed by the UN as being ready for decolonisation and meeting all the formal, legal and political requirements to be decolonised. Now you might think, well, why is that such an important deal? Well, you'll remember that I mentioned the D notice earlier on, and that the British media has made a valiant attempt to make sure that none of this information gets to you, and that you are blissfully unaware of the fact that Justice for All International has now submitted its written request for Scotland to be considered for decolonisation at the UN, and that has been handed over at the UN in the United States in New York. Scotland's formal road to decolonisation has now actually been set in motion. We're now on the way. Now that is also to be followed up, according to Justice for All International in their statement, with further documentation in support of Scotland's case. Now what's interesting about this also is that in the statement made by Justice for All International, they pointed out and emphasised very heavily in their submission to the United Nations that the United Nations recognises that once Scotland is accepted on the list of countries to be decolonised, then only one UN member country is necessary to support and to ratify Scotland's position in that list. Only one more United Nations member, and that can be any country in the world, including many of those countries which have successfully been decolonised from being a part of the so-called United Kingdom or the British Empire. So we now are in a situation where once this legal documentation is fully lodged and it's been considered by the UN, then Scotland is looking for the support of one single country who is a member of the United Nations. And once that support, once that sponsor, if you like, has been gained, then Scotland's journey to decolonisation begins. And what's interesting also, and the Justice for All International statement emphasised this as well, is that for Scotland to have any kind of democratic event at which it decides whether it wishes to end the union with England or not, the British state, in other words, the governing state, the one which has the power over Scotland's future, that would be Westminster, has no right to interfere in any way, shape or form with the process once it begins. They cannot stop it. It has to keep going. And that compels the British state, as it is configured at the moment, to go along with various steps necessary under United Nations laws and international law to participate in the process of the decolonisation of Scotland. And that would mean that, reluctantly dragged kicking and screaming to this process, the English government would actually have to participate in this process, and negotiations with the Scottish side would have to begin. Now, it isn't a short process. I think Craig Murray reckoned, as Craig Murray is the former British ambassador who now is on the Salvo Committee and is also a leading proponent of Scottish independence and ending the Union. Craig Murray reckoned that it would take between 2 and 3 years for, not for the whole process to take effect, but for all of the paperwork and the debating and for Scotland to be added to this list to actually take full effect. So there would be a time lag from where we are now over the next 2 to 3 years where this process continues. After that, the formal process and the actual actions of decolonisation would begin. And that could take longer, but it may not be as long as you think. Many people have said, oh, it'll be decades, a couple of decades at least, before Scotland wins free. Craig Murray appears to disagree with that. And from what I have seen, and this is second-hand comments based on what I think Mr. Murray has said, it's most likely to take about 10 years, roughly speaking. Now, this is a ballpark figure, so we're looking at a period of time approximately 10 to 14 years. Now, that might sound like a very long time to all of us, but since this is a process of international law, it compels the United Kingdom to stay out of what Scotland does, how Scotland organises a ballot and conducts a debate in public about whether or not we should stay in the Union. The British government may not interfere in that. They would be prevented from doing so under the UN conditions. So this is interesting. And what this does, and this is the reason, incidentally, for the alleged D notice, is it hands power to the people of Scotland to decide their own future. Because as the United Nations Charter clearly says, all countries and all peoples have the right to self-determination, and the documents presented by Justice for All International show clearly that Scotland does not have access to the democratic systems that it needs to make this decision, and yet it has the right to them under United Nations law. And that, once that is established, then the British state cannot resist that, not without becoming and being seen to be a completely anti-democratic authoritarian state. So it's a long process. What do we do about it? Well, we wait. We wait until we're called upon to actually act, and that would take the form of a democratic event. Now, there are a lot of disagreements on what the timeline is for this and what other steps might be necessary, but it seems clear to me, at very least, that once the process of decolonisation has been formalised, once the documents have been accepted and the UN has agreed to add us to this list, that the Scottish politicians, the political class that we elect in the next general election here, must then create legislation which fully empowers Holyrood as our elected parliament to conduct another referendum. Now, this referendum is not going to be what we had last time. In 2014, the referendum conducted under the British authority was not self-executing. In other words, had we won it, Britain would not have been compelled to end the Union. It could just have said no, because it was an advisory referendum. It was for information only. The United Kingdom, as you know, had an advisory referendum on leaving the European Union, and it chose to action that, despite the fact that more than 60% of Scots said no, that they didn't want to leave the EU. But we're taken out anyway, because we're basically a non-self-governing territory of England as Britain. So, what will happen? Well, legislation needs to be enacted at Holyrood, which gives Holyrood the powers to hold a national self-executing independence referendum, the result of which would be binding. And that raises the stakes an awful lot higher, because in order to win free, we need to demonstrate more than 50% of Scots voters actually favour ending the Union. I don't think that's such a big ask, considering right now that independence support is somewhere around 53 to 54%. And if Nigel Farage, God help us all, gets into Westminster and becomes the Prime Minister and ends up living in Downing Street, that support level is going to jump to near 60%. And once that is achieved, the kind of referendum I'm talking about, a self-executing Scottish independence referendum, which would be overseen by the United Nations to ensure scrupulous fairness, would happen. And if we win it, we could then end the Union, and we could detach ourselves from Farage's England. And that's where we're at the moment, and that's why we have to start thinking a bit more clearly about how long it's going to take and what our politicians actually need to do in order to make this happen. What Salvo and the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group have done is given us the key to unlock the door to independence. Our job is to elect the kind of leaders that we need in our own parliament to walk through that opening door and declare independence after we have all agreed in majority in a democratic event which we stage under our own rules without interference from England is won. And essentially that is what will happen. I expect that every major announcement that is made, either by the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, Salvo, or Justice for All International will be subject to further British D notices. So the only place you will hear about these developments will be on shows like mine and other pro-independence bloggers that you watch. So watch carefully. Things are about to happen. It's not going to happen rapidly, but look out for the signs. There will be more information coming out from Justice for All International as more documentation is presented to the UN. There will be a procedure where the UN has to discuss and debate the evidence which Scotland has provided in this case, and there will be a decision taken which we hope will be successful, and we will be added to that list. And that will be the major milestone at which our politicians, if they are worth anything at all, need to start taking the regulatory actions necessary to empower our Parliament to hold a binding referendum. And really that's it. I just wanted to try and clear up where we're at, and so that you know what is going on. In the meantime, please keep tuning in to Inde-Car. I'll also be back on Friday morning with Norrie Hunter on Hodmajaket, at which we have a lot of interesting things to discuss. And as you know, Hodmajaket is known for its gloves-off approach to political discourse. So the term Hodmajaket basically means, hang on to my coat, I'm going in to fight. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing on Friday morning. In the meantime, please keep supporting Inde-Car. I always need your help. I'll try and post some more links to my Partick Driver PayPal account. If you want to donate, please keep doing that. It's keeping me afloat. And I'll see you again, I hope, on Friday morning, 9:30 with Norrie Hunter. That's it from me today. Bye for now.